everything south of those three cities in Lake County, all the way to the Polk County line. I'd like to introduce my district staff. I have 2 full-time aides. Every member of the Florida House, and there's 120 of us, have 2 full-time staff positions that support our efforts. Jennifer Wiley is my district aide. She works in the district office in Groveland year-round and runs the office, keeps the finances going and balanced, and keeps my schedule all straightened out and makes sure that I get where I need to be. And most importantly, she handles all the calls from constituents about problems with state agencies or programs or perhaps other issues that come up from time to time. Does a great job. Hannah Jochim is in the back there. Hannah, she's my legislative aide, and she works in the district when we're not in Tallahassee for either committee weeks or for session. She helps me with my legislation, both not only preparing it and getting it ready for filing, but also working it through the process, and I'll touch on that a little bit. She also does a great job. And we think of ourselves as a team of 3, even though I'm front and center as the elected representative. It's really a team effort to work on a task of representing 157,000 people. It's a lot of people to work for all at once, and so having the help is greatly appreciated. So what I'd like to do tonight is sort of touch on some of the things that occurred during the 2016 legislative session. It started in mid-January and ended in mid-March. It's 60 days long pursuant to the Florida Constitution. And the one thing that we have to do pursuant to the Constitution is pass a balanced budget. That's the one and only thing that we have to do during that 60 days. But we typically also consider and pass hundreds of bills of legislation during that time as well. And I don't have the ability or the time to review all of those with you. It's too many. So I'm going to try to pick some of the ones that I think are more important during this legislative update. So we'll go through the session update, and I'll take questions, and then we'll have closing comments. Next slide. Now, the budget this year was $82 billion, and it's balanced. So all the revenue coming in is equal to or greater than the revenue going out, unlike the federal government, which is something that I think we need to consider strongly for the federal government. A couple of things we did. We reduced taxes by $500 million. Most of that was in property tax relief. We bought down the required local effort for the school districts, unlike prior years where the legislature has actually forced the school districts to raise the local property tax levy in order to participate in the Florida Education Finance Program. We also provided a historic level of funding for each student, $7,718 there. And also we funded the Everglades, Lake Apopka, and Florida Springs protection, and still kept $3 billion in reserves for future contingencies. Here's a pie chart of the budget, and you can see how the $82.3 billion to be exact is divided. Healthcare is the biggest chunk of that, and most of that is the Medicaid program, which is a mandatory expenditure since Florida has decided to participate in that. Meaning to say, once we agree to do Medicaid, we have to provide the benefits that we provide by law for all comers. So that can be an expense that gets out of control rather quickly. This year it's 40, oh no, go back, Jim. Education is the second part of the budget. That's the second biggest chunk. And you'll see this 6% slice here, Justice. That's the part of the budget that I had more impact on because I'm chairman of the Justice Appropriations Subcommittee. So my job in the House was to work with staff and the members of the subcommittee to prepare and propose a budget to the House. And then once we approve that budget in the House, to negotiate with the Senate the differences between our House-approved budget and the Senate-approved budget for that area of budget responsibility. So I have much greater knowledge about that purple slice than the other sections, since it's a very big budget and there's not a lot of opportunity to know everything in there at all times. Okay, next slide. The taxation here, I will briefly go over this. And we have a lot of information in this PowerPoint and only an hour to cover it. I don't want to take up more of your time than you had planned on, but I'll stay as late as you want, frankly. But here we have some of the highlights of the taxation package. And one thing we did was that buy down of the property owner, the property tax for the school districts. Also removed permanently the sales tax on the purchasing of manufacturing equipment. That was a high priority for Governor Scott. We got that done. There will be a back-to-school sales holiday later this year in August. and also for veterans organizations when they sell food and drinks at their lodges to fellow veterans, they don't have to pay sales tax any longer on that. Next. We had several, many actually, Lake County budget items. These come to the members from county government, from city governments, from other stakeholders like LifeStream. And basically, I try to vet these budget items ahead of time and then sponsor them if I think they have merit. I don't guarantee that they're going to pass, but I guarantee the effort to try to get them funded. So here we had, these are all items that I supported. And you can see we had quite a few of them funded there. Now, the first one is the Advanced Manufacturing Center. Some of the other members of the Lake Legislative Delegation also co-sponsored these or sponsored them jointly. So we had a team effort on this. I want to make sure everyone understands that. Representative Sullivan, Representative O'Toole, Senator Hayes, Senator Hugel, and myself were all rowing in the same direction. But I took the Advanced Manufacturing Center and told the Appropriations Chairman that was my #1 priority, that we had to get that this year because we had gotten it 2 years ago for some seed money, and we didn't get it in the last year. We needed this construction money to get this project off the ground. So I basically gambled on that because it's a big item, and I might not get anything else, but I still did pretty well with some of these other requests. CR 466A was Representative O'Toole's project, but I helped it with that as well. You can see the rest of the items there. Some of them were local requests, like the ones from Claremont and Groveland. The county had some in there, like Citrus Grove Road, and the 466A was on their transportation list. Genesis Center is an after-school program grounded in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in Leesburg for underprivileged children. And we funded that at the same level as last year. Next slide. We got $200,000 for Beacon College scholarships. That was a continuation as well. And the State Science Fair is actually a statewide appropriation, not unique to Lake County, but the State Science Fair advocates asked me to put that in the queue for the budget consideration, and I did. We didn't get them the full funding they were asking for, but we at least got them the baseline that they were looking for. The ones that are not funded, they simply didn't make it into the budget for whatever reason. You don't get everything. Like I said, that's why you have to be careful what you prioritize. These did not make it. And we had a couple of items actually funded, but they were vetoed by Governor Scott. And I have to say, Governor Scott is a great steward of the public resources, and I see the system working when I get a veto like that. I mean, the governor has a big picture perspective as a statewide elected official, chief executive officer, and he's a fiscal conservative, and he's very concerned about return on investment. So for some of these reentry programs, like the one for Lake County and others, he wasn't prepared to let them go forward because he didn't see the evidence-based programming that was being offered as returning the investment that he wanted to see. So it's the system working. I don't complain about vetoes. It's like the legislature puts these things in the budget, we vote on it, and he has his final say. And we have to respect the separation of powers and the roles and responsibilities that we all have. And so you won't hear me criticize the vetoes. I mean, it's just the system working. Okay, next slide. Now we'll go to the legislative session, and I'll have first a slide about an overview. This gives you an idea of the level of activity. And I think the key number is past both chambers, the totals here, but the general bills are the most important ones. They're the ones that actually change the law for the entire state. Local bills change laws only locally for particular counties or jurisdictions, like special districts, for example. And then we have things like joint resolutions and memorials. And so the total is 279 items. It's a lot of legislation to run through the system in 60 days. Considering the way the process works, and I'll just briefly give you this background. When a member files a bill, it gets referred to committees, usually at least 3, sometimes as few as 2, but usually it's 3 or 4 committees. And you have to move that bill through every committee and get a favorable vote. The threshold issue is getting it heard by the committee. If the chairman doesn't like the bill, he won't hear it. He or she won't hear it. But if it gets heard, you've got to get the votes to pass it each time. If it dies at one committee level, it's gone forever. You can't get it back. So there's a lot of activity when you see 279 bills passing both chambers, in both the House and the Senate. These bills are moving through committees and on the floor, being amended, being debated, being voted on, and they made it through somehow. Okay, next slide. Now these are the bills that I think were just most important to the state of Florida that I thought we should touch on briefly. if anything you see here or hear today, you want more information on, we can get that to you. We can get you a copy of the bill analysis by the professional staff that goes through the entire bill and what it does, how it changes current law, what it will, and how it will impact the budget and so forth. We can provide that to you. We don't have the time to go into great detail today, but we can get the detail to you if you're interested. So first of all, we just have these in no particular order except perhaps bill number, the lower to the higher maybe. But this is one where after the Supreme Court of the United States ruled on gay marriage and said that it was now a constitutional right under the federal Constitution, we have the reality that that's the law. I mean, that's the way we operate in this country. We respect the judicial rulings because we're grounded in the rule of law, even if we disagree with it. I personally don't think the Supreme Court of the United States of America should have made a decision like that because marriage has traditionally been a state issue. And when they rule like that, they're usurping the rights of the states to weigh in on the issue. But be that as it may, they made their decision. However, what we want to make sure does not happen is that the rights of those newly protected, the rights of that newly protected class, the ones that are now entitled to gay marriage, that their expression of their rights, as the Supreme Court has determined them to be, doesn't infringe upon the constitutional rights of other people, such as religious organizations or ministers who, for good faith reasons, based on their faith, object to performing a marriage ceremony between two people of the same gender. So this bill just simply protects that right. If they have a conscious objection, a conscientious objection, if you will, to the performance of that ceremony, they don't have to do it. We don't believe that was compelled by the Supreme Court's decision, but this bill makes it clear so that no one could get sued easily without having to go through a huge preparation of a legal brief to defend themselves. This codifies what we believe is existing law under the Constitution currently. So that's what it does. Discharging a firearm, we've had some problems with folks discharging firearms in residential areas. This simply makes it a crime, a first-degree misdemeanor, if you're discharging a firearm in an area of 1 acre or less density, residential density. Yes. Human trafficking is a continuing struggle in Florida. We have the problem with human trafficking. This is a very insidious crime. It's based on manipulation and domination and abuse and criminal acts. And so this is another bill that we've done, coming after many others. Basically, one of the primary things that occurs in human trafficking is, well, there's drug abuse and drug addiction that's sometimes intentionally caused by the perpetrator, and then they will use that dependency of that person to force them into prostitution in order to pay their debt to the trafficker, if you will, as they have determined it to be. And so we have to make it more difficult for people to engage in these activities and to get away with them. So we're also making it less onerous on the victims because they are victims. And when a young person, 16 or 17 years of age, is lured into prostitution by a trafficker because they're drug addicted and they have to support their habit and they're now manipulated and controlled and dominated and trafficked, we don't want to have that person become the criminal. So here we remove people from under the age of 18 from being prosecuted for prostitution. They're not of majority age. They shouldn't be prosecuted for that crime. We also increase the penalties for knowing and renting space for prostitution. It's now a part of the felony murder rules, so if you are engaged in human trafficking and someone gets killed, that can be a charge of felony murder can now occur under this bill. Also, branding a victim of human trafficking is prohibited. Okay, next please. This was the big water bill, actually two bills together on one slide. The 552 was the big water bill, and it's a massive bill, but it tries to modernize Florida's water quality and quantity policies to help us move forward with adequate water supply and quality. One of the things that it does for us in Central Florida is it codifies the Central Florida Water Initiative. Now, we have 3 water management districts that come together in Central Florida, the St. John's, the Southwest, and the South Florida Water Management District. And they're based on drainage basins for rivers. but they come together in Central Florida. Now, cooperatively, those three water districts have come together and created this Central Florida Water Initiative to coordinate their own efforts with each other, so we don't have everybody going off in different directions based on their pure jurisdictional boundaries. So they have done that voluntarily, cooperatively. Well, this bill codifies that initiative. It makes it now the law of Florida that they work cooperatively to address the great needs for Central Florida for high-quality water. That also helps with Everglades protection, and there's funding for the Water and Land Conservation Constitutional Amendment in 1989. Thanks. I think I covered that. The restoration does include not only the Everglades, but Lake Apopka, which is an important thing for Central Florida. Okay, termination of pregnancies. You might have heard about this. I wanted to include this because it's in the media a lot. I mean, I know that this is a controversial issue for some people, but for me, it's a question of safety for women who undergo this procedure. It is legal in Florida, as it is everywhere else under Roe versus Wade. We want to make sure that the doctors are qualified, that they have privileges at a local hospital, and that they perform these procedures in a proper manner, and that they don't engage in the trafficking of human remains from these procedures. And we don't fund Planned Parenthood any longer based on this bill either. Next. This is a bill that basically also ties into human trafficking, but there was a concern about having testimony from a young victim of a crime live in court, and this allows to have a young person have their testimony videotaped or have it on closed circuit television. It gives them more protection when they're trying to prosecute a criminal for trafficking and those types of offenses. And there's some other provisions there. We're going to try to speed it up to have a lot more ground to cover. Public corruption, this was a big bill that made it into the media as well. Basically, one of the problems, the third bullet point I'll start with, currently it's very difficult for prosecutors to make cases for public corruption because the standard is corruptly or with corrupt intent, and it's very nebulous and hard to prove that. So basically they went back to another concept in criminal law, knowingly and intentionally, and made that the mens rea standard for the crime of public corruption. So that's going to help prosecute cases because the knowingly and intentionally is well established in criminal law. And you just have to prove that they knew or intended to be corrupt and to take a part of that corrupt scheme, whatever it might be. Also, it extends the prosecution for official misconduct to contractors who are involved in these activities, not simply the public official on their end of the transaction, but contractors as well. Okay. Education reform. This was a massive bill, and I don't really like the way these bills sometimes come together at the last part of session, but this bill was one that combined many different bills, and it produced a lot of different educational policies. One of the things that's been in the media is the open enrollment to allow students to apply and transfer to public schools beginning in 2017 if there's capacity. So take an example of, say, someone who lives in Lake County and they drive into downtown Orlando to work in Orange County, and near their place of employment there's a school that has a seat open that would be conducive to the education of that person. It's not being used in Orange County, it's just empty. If that's the case, they could, under this bill, apply to have that seat used by their student, and it would give them more flexibility, more choice. There are restrictions on it, and I'm sure as we go forward with this, we'll find there'll need to be perhaps some tightening or revisions to it once you see how it operates. But that's why it's got a 2017 start date. Expands personal learning scholarship accounts to all students with disabilities. There's a number of items there you can quickly see. Just covers a lot of ground. The emerging preeminence designation for colleges. There was already a preeminence designation. We're now going to another program for emerging preeminence. So schools like UCF and USF in Tampa can get on track to be preeminent, like the University of Florida and Florida State University are already classified as. The objective of this entire effort is to assist our flagship universities to to become nationally recognized, like, for example, the University of Virginia is, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, some of these other state-sponsored universities in other states, University of California at Berkeley, and others that are publicly funded institutions where they have a national reputation, a national draw. They draw the top students from around the world at those schools. And there's no reason for University of Florida or Florida State University to not be in that category if we put the resources there. And then to have the second tier of UCF and USF. That's what this bill did. So you're going to see a lot of emphasis going forward on trying to improve our state universities and colleges. Yes, next. Healthcare reform. These are just some bullet point bills here for you. Transparency in healthcare. The idea there is we want to give consumers information. We want to have pricing information available to consumers. That's not the entire problem, but it's part of the problem. If you have third-party payers and you never know what you're being charged, you really don't have any incentive to hold people accountable for pricing. So we're trying to turn healthcare consumers into true consumers by giving them information. We're also expanding the access to healthcare services by authorizing advanced registered nurse practitioners to prescribe and dispense and administer certain medications. We're like one of the only states in the country that doesn't allow this already. I think it was either 1 or 2 states, including Florida, that did not allow this to happen. Physicians are against it because they like to keep their scope of practice to themselves. But if you're going to improve access to care, you have to have this type of approach. Also, nurses now we have the nurse licensure compact, so our nurses in Florida and reciprocal states who are in that compact can have their nurses licensed without having to retest and recertify every time they move. So if you're a nurse in Florida and say Georgia's a member of the nurse licensure compact, I don't know if they are or not, using it as an example, but a nurse in Florida could go to Georgia and be a nurse there without having to take another test or get another license. Makes sense. The standard of care for nurses is pretty national at this point. Nursing in Florida is not that much different than in other states, and so there's no reason why nurses should be restricted this way. It'll help us recruit nurses for the nursing shortage that we have in Florida. And then we have an effort on the last bullet point there for telehealth utilization. It's going to be a study, actually, a survey. We didn't quite get there this time, but this is a new trend, telehealth, where you would actually call in and talk to a doctor instead of being right in front of them. It won't work in every situation, but in some cases you can actually accomplish a lot that way at less expense. Next slide. Veterans, we always want to be the most veteran-friendly state in the country. That's our mantra in Florida. And so trying to help veterans with different things to help them out. Parking for disabled veterans. Hello, Marie and Andy. Come on in.
Hello. We're late.
It's okay. So you have a publicly operated garage at an airport. You're not going to be able to charge disabled veterans for parking there. And then we have discount for park entrance for military members, and also out-of-state fee waivers for active duty service members. Again, all these things are intended to attract veterans to Florida. Next. Ad valorem tax exemption for deployed service members. If they're deployed under certain circumstances, they can get the treatment of their real property taxes. Military, we have expanded the voter identification cards that are acceptable now to include veteran health identification cards, as well as concealed carry IDs and other government-issued employee ID cards. And then we have this education benefit for United States Law Enforcement members to enroll for college credit at some of our post-secondary institutions. Next. Now I want to bring you to the work that I did, the work that I was working, or the bills that I was working on as a member. Every House member can sponsor 6 general bills during the session. And then you can also sponsor repealer bills without having that count against the 6-bill limit, meaning you're going to just take law off the books, not add law to the books. And then also memorials, which are messages to Congress about issues that we're concerned about in the state of Florida. We want Congress to be concerned about. So I had a total of 10 items that I came up with because I had 6 general bills, 2 memorials, 1 repealer bill, and 1 committee bill that came through my committee that I took on as a sponsored bill. So let's go through some of these here. That just completes the list of 10 there. 10, by the way, is busy. I mean, it's busy. To do 10 bills and be a subcommittee chairman. Hannah, where's Hannah?
I'm out here.
Was it busy?
It was quite busy this session, yeah, with all those bills.
I mean, it's just, I don't know.
Always moving.
I don't have to take 10, but I did.
That's why we like you.
There's so many opportunities to effectuate change, and this is why I like serving. And I do appreciate the honor of serving you as a representative. It's quite exciting to be at the legislature and have an opportunity to sponsor bills and advocate them and see them actually come into being. So anyway, this first one, House Memorial 417, passed both chambers and was sent to Congress, or it is being sent to Congress. But this is putting us on record in the state of Florida to Congress under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution that we want them to call, when 34 states have joined in this call. We are the first, by the way, and we're hoping to get many more to that, finally get to that 34 threshold. But under Article 5, when 34 states petition Congress to call an Article 5 convention on the subject matter, Congress has to call the convention and the states meet and then decide what to do with that particular issue. This is term limits for Congress. And Congress will never pass the term limits amendment sent to the states for ratification, which is the other way that amendments could be proposed. So this is a tool that the founders put in the Constitution, knowing that if Congress got out of control, the states would have the ability to rein it in. So I'm all on board with Article 5. 2 years ago, Senator Hayes and I passed the Convention of States Memorial, which is 3 subject matters that is grounded in the Liberty Amendments, if you're familiar with that. That also passed, and we were the second state in the country to take that position, and now I think 5 or 6 of them have already signed on. So, again, trying to get to 34. And so the whole point of this, by the way, is that we need citizen legislators, not career politicians. Term limits works. I mean, in the Florida House, we have 8 years term limits, 4 2-year terms. In the Senate, it's a total of 8 years, but they're staggered, so they sometimes get 10 years because of that. But it really works because every election, when I came in 2010, there was like 40 members of my class that were new members. And then 2 years later, we had a new class come in behind us, and we lost the senior class because they were term limited. And I'm telling you, every time we trade up when we lose the senior members and get the new members. Because even though we're losing a lot of that institutional knowledge and memory, we're getting new people from fresh off the campaign trail in their districts, of varied backgrounds who have a new enthusiasm for contributing to the legislative process. And I'm just telling you, it's a trade up every time. And so, yes, Vance?
Can I ask a question now?
Sure.
The critics of this say that the problem is then that the officials turn over, but it's the longevity of the staff that is the problem, especially in the federal level. Yes. Because they then perpetuate the rules and regulations. Do you see that happening or would happen at the state level? Well, actually,
that's
this
a great
is
question, Vance, and I'll just repeat it. What about the impact on the staff when the members rotate out and the staff is there for their entire careers? It is a valid argument, a valid concern, but the responsibility for that lies with the members. And I've had members that I've worked with in the Florida House that are strong committee chairs, but don't let the staff run their show for them, or that are actively engaged in the I should say the show, but the business of the subcommittee or the committee. Others, though, you talk to the chairman and he said, well, let me check with staff and I'll get back to you. I don't appreciate that, but that's the approach some of them take. So it's up to the members. I mean, just like any other endeavor, the performance is determined by the person charged with performance. And the voters need to hold them accountable. And there's certainly ways to do that. I mean, if you're the member and you're the chairman of the committee, at least the way the Florida House works, you have a lot of sway over that. And as long as you're upline members, if you're a subcommittee chair, you have a full committee chair above you, and then above that person would be the speaker, maybe through the majority leader, depending on how they want to run the chain of command. But as long as you're backed up by the people higher up, that'll work. You can exert the influence. So the problem is if you have the staff of your subcommittee undermining you and with the staff of the next guy up, and he's weak or she is weak, and then they're not going to stand by you. It hasn't happened to me. I'm not saying it's happened to me. That's when you worry about the staff getting too much power, when the members surrender that.
I meant the staff in the regulatory agencies, like FCC or FAA or others, that they're the ones that, create the rules.
I see what you're saying. And I would just say on that point, Vance, I think the term limits actually could be empowering to the legislative branch, because if you have these bureaucrats in the independent federal regulatories that are thinking that they have more institutional knowledge because they're not term limited, I think it's worse when you have the career politicians in Congress for 30 or 40 years with those relationships with the bureaucrats where everybody goes along to get along. And so there's less incentive to rock the boat if you're in that go along to get along career mode. But if you know you're only going to be there for 8 or 10 or 12 years, you shouldn't be letting that type of relationship interfere with your duties at all. It just seems like you have more independence as a legislator. Anyway, I hope this movement takes hold. The U.S. Term Limits Organization is working on it. I think a couple other states are close to passing this. And this began this year. Florida was #1. We're the first state, not the first state to ask for term limits, but in the past we've asked Congress to pass a term limits and then send it to the states. This is the first time Florida is saying, we want you to call a convention when the number of states has been reached so that we can propose the term limits amendment to ourselves for ratification. And it would take 38 states to ratify such an amendment. And the amendment itself would be drafted by the states at the convention. And the only other thing I want to mention on this before I move along is that oftentimes you'll hear people who are against this idea say, well, what about the runaway convention? That's going to ruin everything. You'll risk everything that we have in order to do this. And I simply can't accept that argument because, first of all, the founders are the ones that gave us Article 5. So in their wisdom, they contemplated that. And they made the threshold very high. 34 states have to ask for this. So you're already going to get, when was the last time 34 states agreed on anything? Maybe Nixon's re-election in '72. But, 34 states. And then if they propose an amendment, you have 38 states required for ratification. So if it runs away for some reason, I don't think it can. I think it can be limited to the subject matter. Let's just say hypothetically we give those folks who are opposing it on the runaway convention the benefit of their hypothesis. You still have the firewall of 38 states have to vote on that in their legislatures or by convention to ratify that. So it would have to be a pretty solid amendment to make it through that process, in which case we shouldn't worry about it. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go quickly here. In 2014, I passed, Senator Stargill was my Senate sponsor, and she worked my bill in the Senate. We got her version of my bill passed, and it reformed the entire Chapter 189 on special districts, which we have over 1,600 special districts in Florida. And my bill was intended to improve transparency, oversight, and accountability. It required every special district in the state to have a website with certain information on it. And then it also required oversight by the legislature of non-compliant special districts and put some teeth in that law. Well, this was a glitch bill. We had to correct some cross-references with a massive rewrite of the entire chapter. We had a few cross-references that needed correcting. And also we strengthened the oversight, transparency, oversight, and accountability language and made it, streamlined it, I should say. It was already strong to begin with, but we consolidated some of the provisions to make it easier to work with. So we got this into law. This is one of the, when I mentioned 10 bills, I had 4 of them that passed all the way through. A couple others made it only through the House. So this is one that made it all the way through. It's been signed into law and it becomes effective July 1st. This was my massive government accountability omnibus bill that did not make it through the entire process. It made it through the House. We put some things in this bill to strengthen the ethics standards for public servants, including for prohibition on a legislator coming into office as a legislator and then taking a job with a state agency that is different than the one he or she had before they were elected. So if you're an assistant state attorney and you get elected to be a state representative, which we have some folks that are in that situation, you can continue to work in that job, and if you qualify for a promotion to senior assistant state attorney because you've been there long enough, you could still do that. But it wouldn't be a situation where you get elected to the state house or state senate, and all of a sudden you now show up as a professor in one of our public universities making six figures, when you would have never got that job if you'd not been elected. We had that in there. Also, we were asking for greater reporting requirements for lobbyists. There is no reporting requirement currently on who they're lobbying and who's paying them. I mean, they have to report their income, they have to report that they're lobbyists, they have to report their clients, but this bill would have required that on a monthly basis they report who they met with and what they're lobbying. Like, I met with Representative Metz to advocate for House Memorial 417 and provide that kind of information so you would know with transparency who's lobbying whom for what. That didn't make it either, though. Also, we defined fraud, waste, and abuse in this bill and put a mandatory provision in statute that every state agency adopt internal controls to prevent and detect fraud, waste, and abuse. We talk about fraud, waste, and abuse, but there's no duty right now to actually have those internal controls. The Auditor General's report in 2013, which started me working on this bill, and we're still doing it 3 years later, said there's no statutory mandate for internal controls in state agencies. So when they find that there aren't internal controls when they do an audit, they don't have anything to tie it back to. Well, you're violating statute, whatever, because you don't have internal controls. There's no requirement. So we need to start requiring that. We're going to bring it back next year. It'll be, I think, the 4th year that I've brought this to. Okay. Federal immigration enforcement. Florida has sanctuary jurisdictions, and I am against sanctuary jurisdictions. I think that Florida state and local governmental entities should be cooperating with federal immigration enforcement authorities to enforce existing immigration law. Now, the current administration doesn't really enforce current immigration law the way it should be. So there's already laxity there. But what little they're doing, we should be cooperating with them and not protecting illegal immigrants from the apprehension under the law. So what this bill did, it first of all defined sanctuary policies. It then prohibited sanctuary policies and gave them 90 days to get them off the books. Provided the ability of the Attorney General or a state attorney to bring an action against a local jurisdiction who has a sanctuary policy to enjoin them, meaning to get an injunction against that, and to impose a financial penalty of between $1,000 and $5,000 for each day that that policy remains in effect. And then also puts in a requirement that sanctuary policymakers who pass that policy be reported to the governor, and it clarifies that they have the governor's removal authority would extend to that as well. So we put some real teeth in this. We also said that if you have an individual who is harmed by an illegal alien, such as in a tort or a crime, like happened to Kate Steinley in San Francisco last July, that that person's family could sue the government entity that had the policy in place and the sanctuary policy maker, although we had to pull back on the sanctuary policy maker part to get it through the House. I had that in the bill, but so it ended up being just against the entity, not the individual policy maker. But we provided that remedy for the family. And the Senate didn't hear this bill. It went absolutely nowhere. But thankfully, House leadership liked the bill and let me bring it to the floor, and we passed it off the floor. And if we get a different judiciary chair in the Senate, maybe we have a chance of getting this bill to the floor over there. But right now, it was dead on arrival over there because that person, the chairman, is from Miami-Dade County, and Miami-Dade County is one of the sanctuary jurisdictions. And you wouldn't believe the folks that were protesting us on this bill. I mean, we were taking a lot of heat on this. Hannah was holding them at bay because she was like, yeah, well, after they were convinced that it wasn't going to be heard in the Senate, they came to Tallahassee to have a funeral for my bill.
Larry, was that the same guy that did the
yes.
concealed carry and the
Yes.
campus carry?
Yes.
What's his name?
Yes. Senator De La Portilla. I might not have pronounced it correctly, but
De La Portilla.
he was against the bill.
Is he going to be there next year too? You know?
I don't know. Everything changes after every election. All the committee chairs and everything.
Let's hope for the best.
It's all new. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Contraband forfeiture is another bill that I sponsored. The Senate version of my bill ended up passing. This was a bill to rewrite, or reform, I should say, the Florida Contraband Forfeiture Act, which is a law enforcement tool that gives law enforcement the ability to seize property that is being used in connection with criminal activity. But the way the current law was drafted, I mean, you could actually have your property forfeited and you would never be even arrested for a crime, let alone convicted. So property rights activists were very concerned with this because some jurisdictions were using this as a financial remedy. In other words, a way of collecting money, where they would go and seize property. And we heard many stories about this, where someone would be in their car. Let's say there's 3 people in a car, and the police officer makes a valid stop for a traffic offense, and then notices that there's contraband in the car, and there's cash as well. Well, they could forfeit that without even arresting anybody for having the contraband. So what this bill does, it says, the general rule is you have to be arrested in order to have your property subject to forfeiture. However, there are exceptions that are valid, and so we did create some exceptions there. If you can't identify who the owner of the property is, like if you find a suitcase full of cash in a car and you don't know who it belongs to, and all the people in the car say they have no idea how it got there and they don't claim it, well, that can be forfeited, even though you didn't arrest anybody. Or if the person who is the owner is a fugitive or is deceased, or if the property is a monetary instrument, we did make that exception for cash. Or if the person agrees to be a confidential informant, or the person who does not own the property is arrested and the owner had actual knowledge of the criminal activity. That's new. That actual knowledge is a heightened standard. Also, when they get into court and they're saying they're going to forfeit some property, we went from clear and convincing evidence to beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's the same level of proof as a criminal violation. And then my bill also had the annual reporting requirements, so we can see how this remedy is being used in Florida and know whether it's getting out of hand or not. We actually had 2 bills running in this subject in both the House and the Senate. My bill and another member's bill, and then our 2 senators had separate bills. And we were told in the House subcommittee only one bill was going to move forward. Whose bill was it going to be? So I told the Senate sponsors of the bill, and we were on the phone, and he said, well, he knew it was a choice, like, which is it going to be? Is it going to be our bill or the other bill? So when I called a senator up on the phone, he said, well, which one do you like, chocolate or vanilla? And I said, I want to do a swirl. And we actually combined the bills. So we did. We took the best of all the bills, we put them into one bill. It was my bill in the House and my counterpart in the Senate. So we took the provisions requiring, the original bill was a conviction-only requirement. We made that arrest-only, and we kept my reporting requirements in and made it one bill, and we got it through. Governor Scott signed it. Okay. Tax exemption for totally and permanently disabled first responders. But what I like about this passed, and it's going to be on the ballot in November in the entire state of Florida. Basically, if you're a first responder who was totally and permanently disabled as a result of an injury in the line of duty, this amendment, if passed, will authorize the legislature to give tax breaks to those individuals up to a complete tax exemption on their homestead property. What I like about this, besides the policy itself, it's very good. First responders who are totally and permanently disabled shouldn't have to worry about how to pay their homestead property taxes. So this is going to take care of that. But what I like about this also procedurally is a constituent called me with the idea. Called the office, talked to Hannah first, then talked to me. We decided to take it on. We worked with the drafting folks in the Guidance and Tax Committee to get it drafted. Made it tight so it's not going to be abused by anybody. It has to be a bona fide injury in the line of duty, and there will be no presumptions involved in that. You have to show medical causation of the injury to the disability. So we made it pretty specific. And we got it through, and it'll be on the ballot. It'll take 60% of the voters to approve it, and if it is approved by that number or greater, then it will be in the Constitution. Yes, sir.
May I ask you a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, this is a twofold question. The first one is, how do you feel, what are your thoughts on the general election this year? The second one is, which of the two parties do you think that you prefer to see going to Washington?
Well, I'm going to decline to answer those questions right now, but I'll be happy to talk to you after the meeting is over, because that's really getting into elections and politics, and I'm here about policy and the legislative session. But I'll be happy to have a one-on-one with you when we're done today.
Sure.
So I'm not evading it, I just don't think it's a question I want to answer for the group, since we're here in an official capacity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Larry, I have a
Thank
question
you.
about this.
Yes.
Why would this be moved to a constitutional amendment versus the legislature just creating statute to implement this?
Well, we want to put the details in statute because they're more difficult to address, and so we want to be able to do that legislatively, but the authorization needs to be in the Constitution.
Why is that?
Because of how the Constitution is currently drafted, where property tax exemptions are contained in a certain section of the Constitution. We looked into that. It's just required. I mean, it has to be done this way because of how the Constitution already reads.
Okay.
So
it's a
and actually, I
constitutional
like it because-
requirement that if
yes.
you modify the language that's in there now that having to do with
The authority for exemptions is constitutional in
Okay.
origin. And also, the other part about it is if we're going to have people that are being exempted from paying property taxes like the rest of us, it ought to be voter approved, I think. I don't think you should have politicians giving out breaks to people that have the most influence necessarily. So I like the idea of voters voting on this because it's basically giving people an exemption from taxes that we all pay. But I'm happy to, to work the legislation to give the people that decision to make. Okay, let's move on. This is another memorial. Did not make it anywhere in the Senate, so I got it through all the House committees, and I was ready for the floor. And the Rules Chairman would have put me on there, but there's no reason to put it on there when it's not moving in the Senate. But this is a really great concern I have about the federal motor voter law. Produced what's known as the federal form. Now, I'm not talking about when you go down to register to vote and there's a state form that we created for state purposes, but there's a federal statute that says when the federal form is used for registration purposes, states have to accept it without asking for proof of citizenship. There is a question on the federal form, and it's answered under penalty of perjury. Are you a citizen of the United States of America, yes or no? So you can check yes or you can check no. And you do have the penalty of perjury on that. However, no one checks it. So the state of Florida, under a Supreme Court ruling, all states actually, under a U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 2012, are not allowed to ask for proof of citizenship when the federal form is used. And so if someone says yes when they really are not a citizen, there's no way to catch that. The other thing is, this memorial addresses, is there are databases currently available to check the entitlement, or excuse me, the eligibility for entitlement of illegal, let me rephrase that. There's a database currently available that is basically intended to be checked to make sure that someone who is not a citizen doesn't receive public benefits to which they're not entitled by law. It's a database of basically those who are not here legally. And they will not, the federal government under the current administration will not allow access to that database. It's this SAVE database. It's an acronym. And there was litigation about this, and the courts said you can't compel them to use the database. But Congress could change the law to say they shall use the database, that they shall make it available. So this memorial is intended to, first of all, allow states to require proof of citizenship when the federal form is used, and also to have access to those databases to prevent voting by non-citizens. Next. This is another bill. We wanted to expand the prohibition of sexual predators getting near children to include their use of drones for that purpose. This did not make it all the way because it wasn't moving in the Senate. The Judiciary Chairman would have heard the bill, it would have gone to the floor, it would have passed unanimously more than likely, but it wasn't moving in the Senate. So there's no point in taking up all that time to push it through the House. This is a district cost differential bill. It's a repealer bill that I filed. This has to do with school district finance. There's an adjustment to the school funding formula that is intended to make up for differences in the cost of living between one area of the state and another. It so happens that Lake County receives 97 cents on the dollar because of the DCD being used in the formula. It's a fraction. It's a multiplier, if you will, that reduces us down by about 3% from where we would be otherwise. It's not the only reason that we're funded low in Lake County. We have a lot of issues dealing with our tax base that puts us lower, with property tax being a big driver of school revenue. But this would certainly help if we just repealed the DCD and everybody got $1 for $1. The big counties like Miami-Dade don't want to see that happen. Broward, West Palm Beach, Hillsborough, Orange, they're not going to support that. But the counties like Lake, Volusia, Marion, all the way up through the Panhandle, smaller rural counties take a hit. So we tried to build a coalition on this. We had about 18 co-sponsors on the bill. We'll have to try it again another way, maybe even asking for a study on the efficacy of the DCD, the fairness of it all. So we couldn't move this bill. The chairman of Education Appropriations Subcommittee is from Miami-Dade County. So it was.
There's our guy.
It was a dead letter. No, different.
Different one.
This is the House
Same.
chairman. So he wasn't going to move the bill. Okay. Juror costs. This just was a way of helping the clerks of the court with their financial woes. By transferring the cost of juror payments from the clerk's budget to the state budget. The bill passed the House but not the Senate. But we funded it through the budget, so it's actually being implemented for 1 year. That was my committee bill. And I did 2 resolutions. This is not part of the 10 that I told you. I did 12 if you count these. These are not hard work. These are relatively easy to do. We honored Mary Catherine Fechtel, Miss Florida, from Leesburg. She was competing in Miss America, and she was number 10 in the country there, in the top 10. And then we also did one for Armed Forces Day, which is coming up a week from this Saturday, May 21st. It's a sort of not an official holiday, but it's a day that's recognized by the federal government since Harry Truman was president, but not widely known. But I've run this resolution several years now. Okay. I have a whole list of co-sponsored legislation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but co-sponsorship is a way of just saying you support a bill more than just voting for it. And sometimes they don't get a vote, so you want to show your support that way. I was a co-sponsor of the guns, the gun bills, as we call them. But one of them was open carry. Now, open carry, by the way, is available in 45 states. It's not something that's new or novel. And in Texas, they just implemented it January 1st of this year. Has anyone read any horror stories out of Texas with open carry? Yet the opponents of this bill were just absolutely convinced it would be almost Armageddon, if we had open carry in Florida. We used to have it before 1987. So, I mean, it's just one of those things that people have a bad perception about it sometimes, but it's just one of your fundamental Second Amendment rights. It's only for licensed concealed carry people as well, who've already gone through training and background checks and so forth. It would actually make us safer, I believe, not more at risk for criminal activity. Same thing for the campus carry bill. And that, some people would argue, well, how come you would allow campus carry, but you won't allow people to carry in courthouses? Well, it's comparing apples to oranges when you do that, because college campuses, by their very nature, are open, sprawling, people coming in from all different places and all different avenues of entry. You can't control access to a college campus, so that's why these madmen sometimes get on there and create havoc and tragedy. So if you have people like former military people that would be concealed carry people on campus, they're in a position to respond quicker to an emergency than if you were waiting for the police to arrive. So it makes perfect sense to me that college campuses would be safer if already screened and trained concealed carry permit holders could carry on college campuses. Thank you for coming, folks. Appreciate it. So that was the basis for my support of that bill as well. And then term limits for appellate courts, for the same reason that I think term limits are good for the legislature, I think we should have them for appellate courts. They would be longer under this proposal, at least 12 years, sometimes up to 14 or 15 if they were appointed midterm. Next. Human trafficking, I co-sponsored that one. I'll just skip through these. That's covered gun bills. The environmental bill, I co-sponsored. Public corruption, I co-sponsored. The anti-Israeli boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. That's a very interesting topic. There's a campaign underway around the country, if not the world, to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel because of the perceived unfairness of Israel towards the Palestinians. That seems to be the mantra anyway. So what we did in this bill is we basically made it, or we're not going to be participating in any such activities, and our pension funds are not going to be subject to that type of campaign. So we're standing with Israel with this bill. And we did a similar resolution as well. That's the resolution 1001. There was another bill, I think we covered in the previous slide, but there were actually two. The resolution, scrutinized companies by Chair Workman, that's the one that actually makes it where we're not going to participate in that type of campaign with our pension fund. And we urge Congress not to go along with it either. Okay, next. Questions? I'd like to take your questions now on things that are on your mind or things that we covered that we didn't cover well enough. Yes, Vance.
The major cities in Florida have regions that administer refugees coming into Florida. Most of them are Haitians or Cubans, so we don't have the problem that some states like Minnesota, Maine, and others have, where they're getting swamped with people from questionable countries. But one of the things is that federal contractors, and I've attended like 3 quarterly meetings in Orlando of the major task force that administers all of this, and they deal with the federal contractors that bring the refugees in that are selected by the United Nations and the State Department. And they don't have any rules. Florida doesn't, and many other states the same problem exists. And the federal contractors, citing federal law, will say they don't have to tell a city or a community that they are bringing in, say, a whole batch of refugees from Somalia or somewhere. And that has happened, and there's been a lot of strife over that. And is there anything that you've heard or seen within Florida State to try and reel these people into control so that at least they have public hearings, they notify the elected city officials and the county officials that they are planning on bringing in a large bunch? And that apparently is going to happen to Sanford, and I can guarantee you nobody there will know about it until all of a sudden they show up in the schools and stuff.
Well, Vance, I don't have any information on that particular issue from the state of Florida as far as anything that was considered in the 2016 legislative session.
Okay.
I haven't seen any bills that relate specifically to that issue. I think it is primarily a federal issue, and we should be getting our federal congressmen involved in getting the information. We shouldn't be just having people brought here into our community without having any forewarning or any knowledge about that. I think we're going to have to be very careful about refugee programs going forward in this world because of the very inherent nature of the Islamic jihadists who would infiltrate us through that methodology. And also just in terms of our overall borders and border control, we have a surge on the southern border now with more people coming from Central American countries transiting Mexico and coming across the border. And I've been told that, or I've seen in the media reports that we have 800,000 people on the deportation dockets because they come in, they claim refugee status, and because of that they have a right to a court hearing, and we have now 800,000 people on the court dockets. It'll take 5 years for them to be processed for deportation. Meanwhile, they're issued a notice to appear, and they simply disappear into the country and they never show up again, or rarely do they show up again for these hearings when they do occur. So it's a huge problem when we do have an obligation under the treaty for refugees to accept people into this country as refugees who have a well-founded fear of political persecution. That is the standard. A well-founded fear of political persecution has to do with political ideology and beliefs, and the government in the foreign country persecuting that person for their beliefs. And if they go back, or if they're deported, they would be at risk for harm, either imprisonment or death. That's the traditional standard for refugees. But now we're applying under the Obama administration. You'll hear them say, well, these people coming from Central America are fleeing gang activity in their native countries. That is not the same thing, folks. We have gang activity in our major cities in this country. I mean,
Gangs are
so
coming here.
we shouldn't be saying, well, because they have criminals in other countries, that anybody who walks across the border is now a refugee, or that we're going to consider them as such. So we have a lot of issues to work through there because we're just being inundated with foreign people entering the country without legal status. And we can't have a country for very long if we don't have control of our borders and enforce the rule of law, which is why I worked on the sanctuary policy bill and on the memorial about non-voting by citizens, or voting by non-citizens, I mean.
So it seems like you're supporting the wall.
Well, I don't think the wall that has been proposed is going to be adequate enough. I mean, I support a secure border, and I think we need to have, whether it's a wall or a fence or some physical barrier to open transiting of the border. But we have to have internal enforcement in this country, because look at all the people that come here legally under tourist visas or under student visas or under work visas that overstay. I've heard it's 40% of the illegal aliens in the country have come legally. I don't know if that's an exact number, but it's certainly a large percentage of the 11+ million people that are here that came legally and overstayed. And there's no internal enforcement to really locate them and deport them. So that has to happen too. It's not just about border, it's not only about border security. You'll reduce the flow, but you won't eliminate it unless you have really good internal controls to enforce the laws inside the country, and you get serious about that. So, have to see what happens with that. Other questions?
Larry, when's your term up?
It runs November in election year, so election day is my last day in office in my current term.
So are you going to be on the primary ballot August 30th or November or what?
Well, I try to not discuss
He's not
elections
allowed to
in this type of setting, Andy. I'll be happy to talk to you about that separately
Okay.
on a one-on-one. But I just in my own personal preference, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong about answering a question, but I hold myself to a standard that we don't talk about elections and politics either in my district office or in anything where I have state resources being used for the official functions that I'm fulfilling. So I'm here to talk about the legislative session and about bills I ran and so forth. And then if you want to talk about that sort of stuff, we're buddies. We can talk about that offline.
Okay.
We don't need to talk about it
Sorry.
in the town hall meeting. You're fine. It's a very legitimate question, but I just don't feel comfortable discussing it. Yes, Bill?
With,
Mr. Chairman of the school board. By the way, before I forget, we do have elected officials here. We had the mayor of Howey-in-the-Hills, Chris Sears. He had to leave, but he was here. He's gracious enough to host us here today, along with our clerk of the town council. And your name again, please?
Brenda.
Brenda. You're the clerk of the town, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Brenda basically is like the administrator for Howey. They call her the town clerk, but you're the city manager. De facto.
So they say.
Yes.
Thank you for letting us use town hall, Brenda.
You're very
Appreciate it very
welcome.
much. And then we have County Commissioner Tim Sullivan here from District 1, and School Board Chairman Bill Mathias here from the Lake County School Board from District 1 also. Not the same District 1, but your District 1 as well.
Yeah, District 1, correct.
I used to have that district.
I know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen.
Larry, I've been.
I had a question.
Oh.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Maria.
Okay. With House Bill 7029 and some 40, what they call train that were added at the last minute,
Yes.
what is the process of that train, because that was a new term to me, and how do you stop the train? Or is there a way?
Well, are you talking about that bill or any bill that's a train?
Well, as a general statement, 7029 obviously I'm sensitive to, and there were 40, I think it was 45 different bills that were tacked on at the last minute. Some of them are not very good. And so how do you stop the train? Is that possible? And will you be going through some of those and trying to fix them?
Well, the train that Bill's referring to is the idea that a bill takes on amendments it's usually during the last part of the session. Things are moving really fast. If you think about the session as a train ride, it starts out on day one, chugging along out of the station, just slowly accelerating out of the station, and it gets to a low speed and a medium speed, and by the day 58, 59, 60, it's chugging down the tracks at full throttle, and it's going to end as soon as the hanky drops and the session is over. So there's a flurry of activity on some of these bills, and so several bills on education may be running different ways, and all of a sudden there's an idea, let's take this one here, and we'll amend this one on, we'll take this part of this one over here and put it on, and we'll take this one from over here and put it on, and we'll make it so that everybody has something at stake on this bill so that it'll pass. And sometimes this is a procedure that occurs between the chambers as well, where we'll make our train and we'll send it over to them, and then they'll do the whole thing all over again and send it back to us. And so there's very little time for reflection on bills like that. I don't like that. But you're in a position where you either take the whole thing or you don't take the whole thing, and there's good things in it. There's some things you maybe you don't like, and there's some other things you may not fully appreciate because of the speed at which it was put together. So you're relying on your committee chairs, your leadership to trust their judgment on how they're doing it, but that's not always going to produce the best result. I like the more reflective way of legislating, where you have 4 committee referrals, or 3 or 4 anyway, and you work one committee at a time, working your bill. There's methodical consideration, there's requests for amendments, there's debate, there's votes, and you get to the floor, you do it all over again. And then you do that in both chambers, and usually you produce a pretty good work product that way. So I'm not a fan of the train methodology. It's an unfortunate methodology that's used by every legislative session. During every legislative session I've been there, though, I've seen it happen. So unless you just said no trains,
Right.
period, and
What would
vote
be
no
wrong
on
with it?
every train, you're going to lose some good policy, though, and some good bills if you say you vote no on all of them. And if you're trying to pick the ones to vote for and the ones to vote against, then you're just back to where you are as a regular rank and file member on any bill.
But some of it didn't even get out of committees, and yet it was tacked onto this train thing. So maybe it didn't have maybe it shouldn't have been there to start with.
Well, there are controls in the House. Like if you have a bill that was filed by a member and it was never heard in the first committee at all, it was just dead, like never got a hearing at all, you can't amend that onto some other bill. It's not available for amendment if it never was heard. If it made it out of one committee and it's now on its way to the next committee, that bill could be pulled and amended onto another bill, but it has to be the same subject matter. So, for example, you can't put criminal provision on an education bill, but you can put education provisions on an education bill because it would, as long as the bill title would receive it and be considered germane. So if it says a bill related to post-secondary education, then it would be colleges and universities. You couldn't put a K through 12 amendment on that bill. But if you have a bill that says a bill related to education, then you could put K through 12 or post-secondary. It could become a train. So I generally try to keep my bill titles more narrow so that they don't have wide receiving germaneness.
So the fact that 7029 was school choice gave it a very broad.
The title would allow those amendments to be on there and considered germane.
I was just
Yes.
trying to understand that.
Yeah. It's not best practice, but it does happen. It's part of the negotiation process. Okay, Marie.
I've just been seeing a lot of stuff on social media and the news of angry people about the whole water situation and the Everglades and all of this in Florida, and condemning you guys and Scott and everybody for the misappropriation of Title or Amendment 1 money. How are we doing on the water?
Well, I mean, the bill that we reviewed earlier addressed the water policy for the entire state. And,
Okay.
I mean, this is a type of subject matter. It's complex. It needs to be science-driven, and it needs to be given consideration for a number of areas of the state. I mean, you have people that want to see environmental protection as a number one priority, but you have agriculture that needs water to grow food and raise cattle. We have a very vibrant agricultural industry in the state of Florida. We want to make sure that we don't pass a bill that makes it hard to continue to sustain our agricultural base in the state of Florida. But we also want to make sure that we don't make the environment worse by doing that, or we hopefully improve it by having the best management practices, so-called BMPs, for the agricultural industry to follow. So this bill does some of that. It also has protections for springs and Everglades and Lake Apopka. So we're trying to improve the water quality and make water available as well. It's a complicated subject, though, and there's a lot of people that have a stake in it. And one thing I'll mention to you, just generally about the legislative process, is that you get a lot of people that are advocating for a position on a bill. They might be coming on a water bill from the environmentalist angle, or from agriculture, or from business, or from just rank and file citizens who are concerned about it. And so it's a balancing of competing interests, and it's not always easy to get to the end result where everybody's happy. But you have to ask yourself, is the bill that I'm getting ready to vote on, will it improve things from where we are now? In other words, the standard isn't, is this a perfect bill? And if it is, I'll vote yes. And if it's not perfect, I'm voting no. I'd be voting no on every bill, including my own, because there's no perfect bill. The way the language is drafted could be interpreted one way or another. You try to make it as good as you can, but you don't always get there. So the standard for me is not, is it a perfect bill? And if it is, I'll vote for it. Is it a good bill? Will it improve where we are now? Not to say we can't come back later and improve it again if it doesn't do enough. That's how I look at it. It's a work in progress. And for a state as complex as the state of Florida, 20 million people, in a vast area from Pensacola to Key West, with lots of different environmental considerations and economic considerations like tourism and agriculture, we want to make sure we balance those competing interests responsibly. So I can't tell you the water bill was perfect, but I can tell you it improves from where we are currently. Some people have greater expectations for it than were realized, and they'll be back next year to try to make it better again. And we'll be there ready to listen to them. It's just the way it works. Hopefully it will continue to work that way where we always are available to listen to good ideas. Okay, who has another question? Anybody? Well, we did this in a pretty efficient manner. It's only 7:15, and we had it scheduled from 6 to 7. So I want to thank you very much for all coming to this town hall meeting. It means a lot to me that you took time out on your evening to come in and hear about what we did, and I do thank you for the opportunity and privilege of being a representative in the State House of Representatives, and I want to thank my staff for supporting me so well, and look forward to continuing to represent you through Election Day of this year when my term expires. And then we'll see what happens after that. So thank you very much again for coming. I appreciate it.
Hold on.